In this video, we're going to look at how do we use test-driven development while developing components. I've done a little bit of boilerplate work ahead of time, and this is the preferred way that you deal with components anyway. So before we start looking at the tests and how we use the TDD approach for this, let's just have a look at what the stubs are that we have here. The very first place that you start on your web component is actually the comments at the top. I'm not necessarily 100% sure of all of the details inside of it, so I've excluded things like the features and whatnot for now, but I do know that there's certain use case scenarios that I want to test for. So the one use case scenario is where I have a combo box and I have these options internally, and when I expand and collapse the combo box, these options display. Another option is where I pass in the items via an items property, and then I have a template in the combo box that I use to render those items. So we'll probably need to have some form of rendering custom logic here. The rest of this stuff is stock standard web component boilerplate. I've got my class that extends an HTML element. I'm attaching my shadow DOM to my root. The shadow root inner HTML is set to the HTML file in the same location as the JavaScript file. And then I have the load function, which performs a request animation frame, and upon the request animation frame, it will perform a task. So one of the things I probably want to change here, just from a consistency perspective, is to say return new promise, and then we can put that in there, and then we can resolve the matter here. Don't think we need the reject just yet, but we can always add it again if we do need it. This way, you know, I've got that async, and the resolve only fires after the request animation frame is done. And then I got my disconnected callback, and I define the custom element. So nothing dramatic here, standard HTML stuff. In the HTML itself, I've got my style with a host, just setting the display to block. In this case, since it's a combo box, I roughly know that I'm going to have some form of a header. The header is going to at least contain an input of type search, and I'm going to have a button that I can click to expand the combo box with. Maybe I'll still add another button for the clear. I'll have to go and look at the designs. But then I've also got my UL that my list items will sit in to go and show. Anyway, then the test is also just the standard boilerplate. And so when I do test-driven development for web components, this is what the test should look like. So at the top, I've got a whole bunch of Deno test inserts, but then I've also got the create mock children here and the element mock. This is required for various reasons. We'll go through that later on. And then the initialization of this. So keep in mind that this is within CRS framework, and so this is a CRS framework requirement. And then on the before all, we import our component, which will then register it with the rest of the system. This is obviously wrong, copy and paste. So this is the combo box tests. I've got an instance that I want to create, and so the way that I create the instance is just the stock standard document.create element as if it is in the DOM. This part here probably requires a little bit of an explanation. So what's going to happen in this guy is that, maybe I can put it side by side. I'm going to start adding stuff here. So if I want to go and get access to this template, or I want to get access to this UL, and I want to cache it, and I want to do stuff, and I need to query the DOM, there's going to be a problem with timing problems in the tests. whereby this is going to try and query those things, but they don't exist yet because the fake DOM hasn't actually created it. So this create mock children takes the instance, reads the HTML, and then creates mock elements for each HTML element, so that the component can use it and you can use it, and it's basically like a fake DOM. To make this work, what we're saying is cache this function for us in a constant, override that method, first go and create the mock elements, and then call this method again. So now that we've sort of stubbed that out for us a little bit, we can go and call the connected callback, which is going to load the HTML. Then it's going to say, okay, we'll load this for us, which means it's going to come into this function. It's going to take that HTML and create the mock elements for us. And then we're going to call this thing, which is going to take us into this. And yeah, we're off to the races. And then obviously on the after each, we use the disconnected callback just to free up any of the memory that we've used. So every single test example that we have, we're basically starting from scratch and making sure that we have a fresh copy. And we have a test where we're going to start off to say, just make sure that this thing actually runs for me. When you run the test, in this case it all runs through fine, but you might need to go here and just say allow all, just to allow the fetch to work, because the fetch on Deno is sitting behind a permission. So here's the stub work. Let's just summarize. Basic web component, it already has its feature comments on it, and you should try and fill this thing out as best as you humanly can before you even start with anything else. Then we just added the generic parts for a web component. The generic parts for this particular component, we're not adding any particular detail yet, just broad strokes. And then we went to the test and just added some stubbing in here for us to get ourselves ready. At this point of time, when you run it and it runs successfully, this is your first commit. You save it, you commit it to Git, and now you have a clean slate to start your TDD process from. We start looking at this component from an HTML perspective. One of the things that you need to remember is that if I can do it in CSS, I must do it in CSS. If I can do it in HTML, I must do it in HTML. I should only write JavaScript for things that are really necessary to write JavaScript in. And one of the places where people tend to do last, but they really should be doing it first, is looking at the accessibility parts required to make this thing work. In the case of our combo box, a lot of the ARIA stuff is required to do. There's no role for us to use, so that's fine, but the ARIA is definitely required. So on the input we have an ARIA autocomplete, which is a list. On the button we have an ARIA pop-up, which is true, and an ARIA expanded, which is false. That means that a combo box can expand and collapse, and when we manage the expand and collapse of the combo box, there are several things that we need to check. The first one is the ARIA attributes of the component itself, and it would also need to update the internal components here. This is a typical case of where the TDD can help us out. So let's start by having a look at that. If I look at the combo box example up here, I'm showing you how the use cases are, but one of the things that we can imagine in our mind's eye is that in the background we have a thing here that says ARIA-expanded equals true or false. That alongside this button, those two items need to stay in sync. So when I expand the combo box, both the combo box ARIA expanded and the buttons ARIA expanded must show that it is expanded, and if it's collapsed, then it must say false. Therefore, it's easy to conceive that there must be a function or some mechanism that drives the ARIA expanded and that synchronizes those things. Now the problem that we have is that from an API perspective, if I get a hold of this combo box, do I want to be able to manually call this combo box and say expand for me or collapse for me? And from a general use case perspective, that's not really a thing. So how do we deal with this? Well, there's a couple of internal mechanisms that when I interact with a combo box, it will expand and collapse. And one of them is clicking on the expand button. We can then go and create the events necessary and click on the button to test whether it will expand or collapse appropriately. Additionally, when I start up the component, this needs to start with ARIA expanded false by default as it is here. But for the component itself, I also need to be able to make it ARIA expanded. What can we do? Well, the first place to go here is to say, on this test that I wrote here, I really should check whether that ARIA expanded is indeed false on the component itself. To do that, because we've got this mock children in place, we can just use standard HTML syntax. So we can say assert equals for us instance dot get attribute ARIA dash expanded, and I want that to be false. If I now really want to be clever about this, I can also go on this test and I can just test for this button. So you can see I've got a ID called drop down, but let's prefix it a bit. So button drop down would be a little bit better. And we can do exactly the same thing here and say, for this guy, I want to go to the shadow DOM and do a query selector for button drop down, and I want to get the attribute ARIA expanded and make sure that that's false. So checking the component, getting the button from the shadow DOM, and then checking the attribute ARIA expanded and making sure that that's false. When I run this now, the tests are certainly going to fail. Why? Because all of my assertions is false. Let us go and do that now in the code and make sure that this test will pass. Here we created a private method called toggle expanded, and we're going to use it in two ways. The first way is we're going to use it during our initialization process to set the expanded to false, and the second one is when we do our click events, we want to toggle the expanded to true and false as it expands and collapses. The parameter that we passed on here is a Boolean parameter that we set to true during our initialization phase, and what this does is it pretends that the combo box is expanded, because if it sees it as being expanded, it will force it to be collapsed by default. This way I don't have to write two different functions to do the same thing. For the most case, this will just never be set, but in those cases where I want to force it to be collapsed, I can pass on the value true there. On this function, it does all the required work to set this stuff up. And when we go to our test, you can see that we still have all of the necessities there. I did make one mistake where I didn't add the hash to the query selector, but having fixed that and we run it, we can see that our tests are now running through. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add the toggle functionality on the button, so that when we click on the drop down button, it will show the list or hide the list. And again, let's start off by writing the test first. So here's our test. The the first thing I'm doing is creating a mock element for us of type button. The whole idea for this is I want to fake out that this is the button we clicked upon. You can also go and query the Shadow DOM and get an instance of this component if you want to. This is just easier and more explicit from a testing perspective to understand what you're doing, because all we actually really after is to get a hold of this ID within the click event. So we don't have any of our click event stuff done yet, but the idea is that I'll implement the click event, and if the target is this button, then I want to toggle the expansion. So we're going to do the click event handler, and we have an event mock where the target element is equal to this button that we've created, and then we want to assert that the instance has an expanded, which is true because it should not be expanded, and we click it again and we want to assert that the expanded is false. So when I run this now, it's obviously going to fail, right, because I haven't actually implemented any of that. But let me go and do the implementation of that, and we'll have a look at this again. The first thing that we're going to do is just create this field called click handler, and it's going to point to this .click, which is at this stage empty, and we bind it to this. And then we're going to create a read-only property called get click handler, so it has exactly the same name, and inside we're just going to return that field back. So what's the point of that? The point of that is that this is read-only. You can't override the click handler, and the implementation behind this stuff is hidden, so you can't mess with it either. Just to make things clear though, we're just going to put in a comment here that says public for testability, just to make sure that people come in and they say, oh, well, why is this thing public? Say, oh, okay, this is a specific scenario we want to expose this for testability. Now, there are very, very, very few cases where this will be acceptable, but in cases like this, it's actually fine. Here's the implementation of our click event. So the first thing we do is going to get the target, and we can see we get it from the compose path, give us the first item, and then we check if the ID is equal to this button that I'm interested in over here. Then I want to perform this toggle expanded. And so if I look at my test here and we run it, we can see, okay, great, there it is, all functioning just as expected. So the expectation here is not that you necessarily go and create a ton of tests ahead of time and then try and do the implementation, as you might be able to do with certain classes or methods and stuff. But in this sort of a case, go and write the test first, get a clear picture in your mind as to what needs to happen there, and then go and write the functionality sort of to match that. Here you can also see that this is an async action. So the only thing that's now sort of left for me to do here is to add my comments, and let's just make this a event. And we're done. So I'm not going to belabor the point. You kind of get where I'm going with this, but writing TDD for web components can actually be quite a simple thing. The initial boilerplate is important, so if you need to go back to the initial part of the video and have a look at all of the components that are functioning at that time first, then please do so. But what I've tried to exhibit here is that you can do web component development with a TDD approach with a great amount of success.